The raiders reached the lake by midday. They had burned a homestead on the way and expected another. Instead, they found a cold hearth, an open door, and no cattle in the field. The family was not hiding in the woods. They were out on the water behind a wooden wall on an island that had not stood there a lifetime ago. The raiders could see them. They could not reach them. Why would a family leave a good house and row out to a heap of timber and stone in a cold Irish lake? Because that heap of timber and stone was the safest place in their world. We call these places crannogs, artificial islands built by hand in the shallows of a lake, one load of rock and brushwood at a time. The Irish raised somewhere between 1,200 and 2,000 of them, and they kept building and rebuilding them for more than 1,000 years. Long after the raiders in this story were dust, families were still rowing out to islands their great-grandparents had piled up by hand. This is who built them, how a farming family turned open water into a fortress wall, and why it worked for over 1,000 years. Ireland, around the year 600. There were no cities, no stone castles, and no single king who ruled the whole island. The country was carved into roughly 150 small kingdoms called tuatha, each with its own king, and each king answering to a bigger one above him. People lived in extended families on scattered farms, and their wealth walked around on 4 legs. Cattle were money. A man's standing was counted in cows. That created a very specific problem. When your wealth is livestock, it can be stolen in an afternoon, and in early medieval Ireland, stealing it was practically a national institution. The cattle raid was so common it became the subject of the country's greatest epic. Lifting your neighbour's herd was how a young warrior made his name, and the raiders did not always stop at cattle. They took grain, they took tools, and they took people, who could be sold or held for ransom. But there was no police force to call, no central state to send soldiers, no standing army at all. Each small kingdom could put a few dozen fighting men in the field when its king called, and not a man more. The standard home was built with trouble in mind. Most families lived in a ring fort, a circular bank and ditch with a palisade on top, and there were more than 40,000 of them across the country. A ring fort was good against a casual raid. It was a fence, a deterrent, a way to keep livestock in and opportunists out. But a bank of earth only works as long as the people behind it can hold the wall. Against a determined band who outnumbered you, a ring of soil and timber bought you minutes, not safety. An ordinary family was left with a hard question. When armed men come over the hill for your cattle, your grain, and sometimes your children, what do you actually do? You can run for the bog and lose everything you own. You can stand and fight people who do this for sport, or you can make yourself impossible to reach. The third option is the one that built an island. Picture a shallow margin of a lake, maybe waist deep, a stone's throw from shore. The builders started at the bottom. They drove rings of oak posts down into the lake bed, sharpened at the base, hammered through the mud until they bit into firm ground. Inside that ring they dumped everything they could carry. Stone hauled from the fields, brushwood and timber, peat and clay, the bones and rubbish of daily life, even worn-out dugout canoes, all of it layered up like a giant cake until the pile broke the surface of the water. And one detail tells you these were not thrown together. The ring of posts was not just a fence, it was a corset. It held the whole soft mound together and stopped the lake from washing it away year after year while the family lived on top. On the larger islands, the builders faced the base with a wall of stone to take the constant chewing of the water. Some sank their posts with interlocking joints, timber cut to grip timber, so the ring held under pressure from the soft fill pushing out and the lake pushing in. The scale of it is hard to picture now. A typical crannog ran about 25 metres across, roughly 80 feet, and stood 1 to 2 metres above the lake bed. To raise a platform that size out of open water meant moving hundreds of tons of stone and timber by hand in baskets and on the backs of small wooden boats. When Lough Gara in the northwest was drained in the 1950s, archaeologists found 31 dugout canoes sunk around its islands, the pickup trucks of the whole operation. And the oak gives up its secrets in a way stone never could. Because the timber sat waterlogged for centuries, sealed from the air that would have rotted it, archaeologists can read the growth rings in the surviving posts and date them in some cases to within a year of when the tree was cut down. A crannog is not a vague smear of the early medieval period. It is a specific winter, in a specific rain, when specific people felled specific trees and went to work in the cold. Think about what that actually took. A family, or a few families together, deciding that the safest thing they could do was build the ground beneath their own feet. They did not borrow a lord's castle or petition a king. They built an island. But an island is a strange thing to leave a dry, warm farmhouse for, unless the water was doing something a wall could never do. Water is the whole trick. A stone wall can be climbed, undermined, or knocked down. Cold, deep water cannot be any of those things. To get at a family on a crannog, attackers had exactly two choices, and both were bad. They could swim in armour across open water toward people standing dry and ready above them, or they could come across the causeway. Most crannogs had a causeway, a narrow path of stone and timber running out from the shore, and the builders made it as nasty as they could. The path was often laid just below the surface of the water, so it sat hidden, the same colour as the lake, invisible to anyone who did not already know the route. Some causeways zigzagged, some were built deliberately too narrow for more than one person to pass. This is the detail that turned a house into a fortress. An attacker who found the causeway still had to walk it in single file, slow, balancing on a submerged path he could not see, while the people on the island stood behind a palisade and a gate, dry, armed, and waiting. Many crannogs put their one approach against a fortified entrance, so the last few steps onto the island were the most dangerous of all. A handful of defenders could hold that approach against a far larger force because the lake forced the attackers to come one at a time, in the open, exactly where the defenders wanted them. The grandest islands did not bother with a causeway at all. They sat out in deep water, reached only by boat, which meant an attacker had to launch onto the lake in something the defenders could see coming from a long way off. On those crannogs, the choice was not who held the wall. It was who controlled the water, and the family on the island always got there first. The arithmetic was simple, and it favoured them every time. Burning their empty farmhouse on shore cost the raiders nothing the family could not rebuild in a season. Reaching the family themselves cost more than almost any raiding party was willing to pay. For a band of men looking for easy cattle and a fast getaway, a fortified island in cold water was the opposite of easy. Faced with that, most raiders took what they could find on shore and left. For the family, the whole defence came down to a few minutes. When the alarm went up, a shout from a neighbour or smoke on the next hill, they drove what cattle they could toward the water, loaded the children and the grain into the canoe, and pushed off. By the time the raiders crested the rise, the people they had come for were already 100 feet out, watching from behind the palisade. The lake had closed behind them like a door. Which raises a question the archaeology answers in a way you might not expect. If these islands were just panic rooms for frightened farmers, why do some of them hold the richest treasure in early medieval Ireland? The answer is that crannogs were never only for the poor and the frightened. Some were the homes of kings. South of the hill of Tara, in County Meath, sat a crannog called Lagore. From roughly the 7th to the 10th century, it was the royal seat of the kings of southern Brega, a small but serious dynasty. When the Harvard archaeologist Hugh Henken excavated it in the 1930s, what came out of the mud made Lagore one of the richest sites of its age in Ireland. Fine metalwork, weapons, gaming pieces, imported goods, the leavings of an actual court. A royal crannog like Lagore was also a kitchen, and the food that came out of these households is its own lost world. If you want to cook your way into it, that is exactly what we make over at the Medieval Way store. The Practical Recipes collection turns these dishes into meals you can put on the table tonight. The Sourdough Manual walks you through the wild yeast bread these families lived on, and the Sourcing Guide helps you track down the real ingredients. Links are in the description. The island at Lagore had been rebuilt 3 times, with 3 successive palisades, each generation raising the walls again, and the human remains pulled from its earliest layers tell a darker story than treasure. Some of the bones show signs of decapitation, and archaeologists who have studied them argue the site may have been a place of judicial execution, where a king's justice was carried out on his own fortified island. A crannog was not only where power hid, it was where power was held, displayed, and enforced. While kings were fortifying their islands, scribes on the mainland were writing things down that prove how seriously everyone took these places. The Irish annals, the year-by-year chronicles kept by monks, mention crannogs again and again, and never as quaint cottages. In the year 933, the Annals of the Four Masters record the destruction of a crannog as a notable event, the kind of thing worth remembering, like the fall of a fort. Centuries later, in 1246, a king named Turlough O'Connor escaped from a crannog where he had been held, which tells you they were strong enough to serve as prisons. The same chronicles note men drowning as they crossed to these islands in the dark, and islands changing hands in war. Put it together and a picture forms that has nothing to do with simple farmers hiding from trouble. The crannog was a tool the whole society used, top to bottom. A king fortified one to hold a kingdom and to break his enemies. A farmer built a smaller one to hold a family through a bad season. Same idea, same water, different scale. But the most surprising thing about crannogs is not who used them. It is how astonishingly long they kept using them. We have been talking about the medieval centuries, the annals and the kings and the Viking Age. The Irish did not invent the crannog in the Middle Ages, though. They inherited it. When Christina Fredengren, a Swedish archaeologist, spent 5 years surveying the crannogs of Lough Gara, she found islands that were not medieval at all. Some had been built more than 2,000 years ago, in the Iron Age and earlier, then reused, abandoned, and rebuilt across the centuries by people who found the old island still sitting there, still useful. One crannog on that lake, at Rathinan, was settled, walked away from, and settled again on 3 separate occasions. The same patch of made ground pressed back into service whenever the world turned dangerous. Lake dwellings in Ireland reach back thousands of years before that, into the Bronze Age and beyond. Piling up an island and living on it is one of the oldest building traditions the country has, older than most of what we think of as ancient. And the longevity should change how you picture these people. We build a modern timber house and expect it to stand for 50 or 60 years. A concrete one, maybe a century. These families, with no machines, no cranes, and in many cases no mortar at all, piled up structures by hand that have held their shape underwater for 1,000 years and more. Some only return to daylight when a lake is drained and a perfect ring of stone appears where the water used to be. That is not luck. That is engineering good enough that we keep finding it intact, 1,000 years later and more, while the houses we build now will be gone in a single lifetime. Why did people finally stop building them? Not because Ireland became peaceful. The danger had simply changed shape. For 1,000 years the threat had been the raid. Men who came over the hill took what they could and left by nightfall. Against a raid, an island is close to perfect because all you have to do is outlast a few bad days. The raiders cannot afford to wait, and you can. But starting in 1169, the Anglo-Normans arrived, and they did not raid. They conquered. They built stone castles that did not go home at sundown, garrisons of armoured men who stayed and held the land around them permanently. Against an enemy who never leaves, hiding on an island for a few days solves nothing. The water that protected you now traps you, because the men besieging the shore have nowhere else to be. A lord with a castle could simply sit on the lakeshore and wait the family out, season after season, until hunger did the work no sword could. Even then the crannog refused to die quietly. Irish lords were still fortifying and using them well into the 16th century, adding walls of turf and stone, and rebels and outlaws were still sheltering on overgrown islands as late as the 1600s. But the world that made them worth building was ending. Gunpowder made walls and water less decisive than they had been. The English conquest brought drainage, settlement, and surveyors with maps, men whose whole job was to measure and tame a landscape that had always kept its secrets. The lakes that had hidden the islands began to be lowered and emptied. The crannog itself never failed. The world around it changed, and slowly made it unnecessary. And then for a few centuries they simply slept. Lakes rose over them. Reeds and trees took hold. They became anonymous little islands that locals rowed past without a second thought, or vanished entirely beneath the water. The knowledge of what they were drained away with the people who had built them, until a crannog was just a strange green mound in a lake, a place for stories about fairies and the old folk who had gone into the water. The recovery came almost by accident. When the great drainage schemes of the 19th and 20th centuries lowered Irish lakes to win farmland, the islands came back. Lough Gara alone gave up around 300 crannog sites when it was drained in 1952. An entire submerged settlement nobody had known was there, complete with the canoes that had once carried families out across the water. Today the National Monument Service keeps records of well over 1,000 of them, and surveyors still find new ones, especially in the drumlin lakes of the northwest and the Midlands. You can stand on a reconstruction at Craigavon in County Clare and see one rebuilt the old way, palisade and all, the way it would have looked to a tired family rowing home in the dark. And those are only the ones we have found. Surveyors believe many more sit undiscovered beneath water that was never drained or buried in bogs that were once lakes. Their oaks still sound in the dark. The rest are still out there. Quiet rings of stone and oak in cold water, raised by hand by people who had no army, no fortune, and no king's permission, and who decided that if the world would not keep their families safe, they would build a place that did. We dig up the forgotten engineering the modern world walked away from. What buried or drowned structure should we investigate next? Subscribe, and let's keep digging.